Hi everyone. This is Ancient Rome at Flagler College. Today I want to discuss the end of the reign of Augustus and the succession to the emperors who followed him, and we'll go through the entire Julio-Claudian dynasty today. It's called the Julio-Claudian dynasty because this is not entirely, in fact, not even largely, the family of Augustus. Which is where the Julio would have come from, because he had been adopted into the clan of the Julii, right, from Julius Caesar. It is instead mostly descended from Claudius, who was the first husband of Livia. It could just as well be called the Livian dynasty, I suppose. Succession is the area where I think it's safe to say Augustus experienced his greatest setbacks. His hopes for succession, because he had no adult sons, rested largely on his daughter Julia. And this poor woman was yanked around by her father throughout her life, being married to whichever patrician or whichever courtier happened to be the best pick in the eyes of Augustus. Initially, this was a guy named Marcus Marcellus, and Augustus seemed to have been impressed with this guy. He was quite young and up and coming and promising and talented. But this also created some problems within his own household, as his wife Livia was scheming to have her sons become kind of primary in Augustus's eyes and maybe inherit from him. In addition, his right-hand man Agrippa, it seems, had plans of his own and wanted to have pride of place there. And so when he married Julia to Marcellus, he sent Agrippa away as a proconsul to some other area of the empire, and I'm not sure exactly what he did within his own home with Livia. But unfortunately, Marcellus died only a couple of years into this marriage. And upon his death, Augustus decided that Agrippa was the man for him, or rather for Julia, that this was his best chance, for Julia to have children, specifically sons, whom he could adopt and whom he could set up as his heirs. And in fact, this happened. Julia and Agrippa, even though Agrippa was old enough to be her father, this was not uncommon. That marriage produced 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. 2 of the children, Agrippa the younger, Agrippa Postumus as he's known, and Julia the younger, were both, they were not the favorites, so to speak, in the eyes of Augustus, and both of them ended up exiled along with their mother later on. But the older 2, Gaius and Lucius, the 2 oldest sons, were the favorites of Augustus, and he quickly adopted them and designated them as his heirs. When they came of age, he introduced them into public life by serving as consul along with them. But unfortunately, this is the curse of the long life. Both of these young boys ended up dying in their early adulthood, and Augustus outlived both of them. And so at that point, and Agrippa died as well in the year 12 BCE, actually before his sons did. And so all of the other potential heirs ended up dying, and Augustus was left with little choice but to give in to his wife and to designate her older son Tiberius as his heir. And Augustus was not happy about this, but particularly unhappy about this was his daughter Julia, because he married her to Tiberius. This was an unhappy marriage. Julia ended up involved in several high-profile affairs. This caused no end of scandal. She would have been, the queen of the tabloids if she lived today, and she was the equivalent of that in ancient Rome. All sorts of rumors spread about her, many of them, it seems, true. She did this largely to spite Livia, whom she despised, and the feeling was mutual, I guess. But Augustus, who had, as we discussed briefly, been decreeing all sorts of moral laws about monogamy and about trying to get people to have more children and sort of championing traditional family values within his own home, within his own family. He's got these scandals, and so he eventually exiled Julia off to an island in the Mediterranean, along with 2 of her children who had fallen out of his favor. And he only recalled her at the very, very end of his life. And so, this was a kind of failure of Augustus's attempts to produce an heir by using his daughter Julia in several respects, right? And so the children of Livia and Claudius ended up becoming the chosen ones here, specifically Tiberius. But Tiberius was a rather unhappy fellow. He and Augustus didn't get along, and certainly his marriage with Julia was a disaster. And so by the time he inherited the throne, at the age of 55, which was probably in his mind way too late, he was not a happy fellow. And in addition to that, Augustus, at the end of his life, while he designated Tiberius as his heir, he made Tiberius adopt the son of his brother Drusus, who had died in the meantime, because Drusus had been married to, and I'm going to go to the Julio-Claudian family tree here to give you some sense of this. This is simultaneously complicated and not overly complicated, in the sense that the family tree doesn't branch a whole lot. There's so much intermarriage, so much interbreeding, or inbreeding, we might say, within this family, that it's not surprising that some of them have all sorts of problems, mental and otherwise. That may come from the lack of variety in their gene pool, but I'm not a geneticist. I guess I can't determine that. And so Drusus here, had been married to Livilla. No, I've got the wrong person. This is the Drusus we're talking about. This is Drusus the Younger, who was the son of Tiberius. Okay, so he had been passed over in favor of Germanicus. This is Germanicus. And Drusus was married to Antonia Minor, who was the daughter of Octavia and Mark Antony. Okay, but the important thing for Augustus is not that this was the child of his sister and of his rival, for that matter. It was that this had produced the offspring of Agrippina the Elder, who was then married to Germanicus, and she was the daughter, Germanicus, the son of Drusus and Antonia, was married to Agrippina the Elder, who was one of the children of Agrippa and Julia, which meant that the direct bloodline went to Agrippina, and thus the children of Germanicus and Agrippina would be the direct descendants of Augustus himself. That's why he wanted Germanicus to become the next emperor after Tiberius. Okay, Tiberius wasn't happy about this. He would have preferred his own son Drusus to be his heir, but Augustus extracted this from him, and he adopted him, and away we went into the next reign. Now, the reign of Tiberius is marked by, first of all, he's actually, despite his rather suspicious personality, he was cynical, he despised the Senate and all senators, and, couldn't talk to senators with a straight face. He just loathed them, it seems, because he had been the butt of jokes, and in part due to his wife's bad behavior. He was a cuckold. That's not a very nice thing, I guess, for a man to be, especially if everybody knows about it, and everybody did, right? But he was effective in the sense that he took the reign himself. He did not bow to the wishes of his mother, who continued to want to influence the state of affairs in Rome. He kind of retired her forcibly from public life. He even executed one of the sons of Agrippa and Julia, the one who had been exiled, in case this guy, whose name was Agrippina, would rise up to become a rival, given that he had the blood of Augustus also flowing through his veins, right? So he was quite effective in consolidating control, but he was isolated, and that was one of the key themes of his reign. Now, his plans for succession didn't exactly pan out. For the first in the first instance, Germanicus was kind of a playboy and, not a very responsible youth, whereas his own son, Drusus the Younger, was quite responsible and even successful as a military commander, while Germanicus was not. But both of these guys ended up dying. And Germanicus first, and it seems that the Tiberius was quite happy about that, and he made Drusus his heir. And there was also rumor that Germanicus had been poisoned, and there was all sorts of scandal that arose from this. And so, with all of this going on, and with his heirs then dead, Tiberius was kind of backed into a corner. And one of the things he did to remedy the situation of his just hating to be in Rome and hating to interact with senators is he retired at the prompting of his closest advisor, the Praetorian prefect Sejanus, to Capri on the Italian coast down in Campania near Naples. What the photo you see on the lower left here of the slide is part of the ruins of Capri. These were pretty nice digs. Archaeologists have done a lot of work there, and they've discovered some pretty incredible opulence that Tiberius lived in. There was a cave, kind of a natural cave, that he turned into a sort of bathhouse that was fed by the sea there. And there are all sorts of statues that have been uncovered, and it seems this is where Tiberius would hang out with his mistresses and, have a good time. But he was not an irresponsible individual. He tended to pore over correspondence from Rome, and he issued decrees. He really ruled effectively, especially given that he was ruling from many miles away. He relied for his representation in Rome itself on Sejanus. And unfortunately, Sejanus seems to have been playing him false for most of their relationship. Sejanus tried to convince Tiberius to marry him to Livilla, who was had been the wife of Drusus, his son, and this would give him control over Gemellus, who was the grandson of Tiberius and who had been designated as one of his two heirs, the other one being Gaius, who was the son of Germanicus, and so his adopted grandson, so to speak. And Sejanus, when Tiberius refused him this, it seems that Sejanus seduced Livilla, and the two of them may have been involved in a plot against Tiberius. One thing led to another, and Tiberius found out about this. Livilla revealed the plans, I guess, and Sejanus was arrested and executed, and Tiberius ended up dying a very sad and lonely man, with his only close friend having been a betrayer of him, right? And so he did not say which of these young men, Gaius or Gemellus, was to be his direct heir. He simply designated both of them. When he died, however, the Senate, probably hearkening back to Augustus himself, chose the one who was related more closely to Augustus. If we go back to the family tree here, we can see that the next emperor was Gaius, otherwise known as Caligula, who was descended from Germanicus, and Agrippina the Elder, who was the daughter of Julia, right? So this is the grandson of Julia directly from Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder. Okay, so we're back to a direct heir of Augustus himself, right? Unfortunately for Augustus and his legacy, Gaius ended up being the worst, most scandalous ruler of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He had the nickname Caligula because when he was a young child, he would visit his father's military camp, and apparently they had crafted a special military uniform for the young boy, which included these things, these kind of military boots or sandals, which were known as Caligula. And so that name was given to him by the soldiers, and it stuck. It means little boots, okay? And it ended up being a kind of pejorative and insulting term against him, especially as he became more and more scandalous. Before I forget to mention this, the image that you see on there is an Egyptian obelisk. It was common for the rulers of Rome in controlling Egypt to bring Egyptian antiquities to Rome. Gaius, it seems, was responsible for bringing this one, which was placed in the Circus Maximus, the chariot racing arena. That same obelisk sits today in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican, which is what you're looking at now, right? But it dates back to that. The cross on the top is not from that period. This was added later, obviously. Gaius was a rather profligate individual, and he may have gone increasingly insane as his life went on. So he inherited the throne in the year 37 CE, and all of the dates at this point are going to be CE unless I say otherwise. And so in the year 37, and he only reigned for 4 years because he ended up in so many scandals and alienated so many people that he was eventually assassinated. There were rumors that he was involved in incestuous relationships with his own sister, or maybe multiple sisters. He came from a fairly large family, as we saw on the family tree there. And there's another story about him that he tried to have his own horse elected as consul and tried to force the Senate to do that. He ended up making a lot of enemies. And so the sources are biased against Gaius, but we do, if we read between the lines, we'll discover that part of this might have been that Gaius, it seems, was interested in restoring, for real, some of the structures of the Republic. He issued a decree that consular elections would be held in such a way that was more in keeping with the traditional election process, despite also trying to get his horse elected, I guess. That he had made more lax some of the restrictions that Augustus had put into place on certain books and ideas and things. And so he was trying to pull back from the more autocratic nature of Augustus and probably Tiberius as well. We'll never know what might have come from this, because the Praetorian Guard got involved in a conspiracy with some of the senators who despised Gaius, and they assassinated him in the year 41. Okay, and at that point, there were some senators who started to speak of restoring the Republic and getting rid of the dynasty of emperors, but the public at this point demanded that someone be named in his place, and so the conspirators had already had someone waiting in the wings. This was Claudius. Let's go back to the family tree here and note that Claudius was the son of, let me think here, Drusus the Elder, the brother of Tiberius, okay, from his marriage to Antonia Minor, meaning the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia, okay. So we're back to the Claudian side of the family tree. This is the Julian side. This is the Claudian side. All right. And Claudius was a controversial figure as well, not because he was scandalous and profligate like Gaius had been, but rather because he, it seems, had a neurological disorder that caused him several physical impairments. He stumbled a great deal. He stuttered really badly. Apparently when he got agitated, he tended to drool uncontrollably. And within his own household, he had been the subject of ridicule. Augustus and Livia apparently despised him and rejected him as a grandson, and he was made fun of and to no end. But he had remedied this situation by becoming a scholar and studying Roman administration. He studied history with Livy, and ended up learning the Etruscan language, and ended up writing several books on the Etruscan cultural tradition. Unfortunately, none of those have survived, right? So Claudius was, among all of these emperors, by far the most intellectual, but also a not so well-respected figure because of his disabilities. To win over some of the Roman public, and especially the army, he sent troops into Britain and completed the conquest of what became the Roman province of Britannica, this would, or Britannia, I should say. Britannica would be the adjectival form of it. Britannia, which is roughly coterminous with modern England, not Wales or Scotland or Ireland. And so this is a new province that he creates. This is the first real expansion in about 85 years from the time of Augustus's annexation of Egypt, and so this is a great success. And Claudius was a careful administrator and really quite an able political figure. One of the things that was key to his administration was that he relied on capable freemen. This is even more of a meritocracy probably than existed under Augustus. There were several of these men, these are meaning freed slaves, who showed great capability, and some of them achieved not only notoriety but also wealth under him, but they helped him govern pretty effectively. Where he really went wrong was in his relationship with his wives. And as a disabled and somewhat ridiculed figure, he did not choose wisely. His first wife was a great beauty, renowned for her beauty, but she was also faithless. She did bear him 2 children, a boy and a girl, Britannicus and Octavia. But she, it seems, had several affairs and even plotted with one of her lovers against him. When he found out about that, he rather reluctantly had her killed because apparently he was quite in love with her, despite her affairs. And then he, unfortunately, for him, married Agrippina the Younger, who was the youngest daughter of Germanicus, meaning, he's he's marrying back into the Julian side of the family, right? And Agrippina the Younger was an incredibly manipulative woman. She, for instance, insisted, and Claudius, who seems to have gone along with whatever his wives wanted him to do, being so enthralled with them, she convinced him to pass over his son Britannicus and to name her son Nero as his heir. And he not only did that, but he married Nero to his daughter Octavia, to kind of cement the relationship, adopted Nero. Yes, this means that we have step siblings marrying each other and, all sorts of things going on. The family tree doesn't branch a great deal, as we've mentioned. And once she had secured this, it is quite possible that Agrippina then plotted with her lover, who was one of the advisors of Claudius, to have him assassinated. And Claudius died under rather suspicious circumstances. It seems he ate a dish of mushrooms and ended up with terrible stomach pains and passed away, probably having been poisoned. But Agrippina maneuvered her son quickly into being crowned as the next emperor, and Nero succeeded him, right? Nero ruled for 14 years and ended up being nearly as scandalous as Gaius was, and because his reign is longer, there's more material, I guess, to talk about. But Nero is also a polarizing figure. It seems he was incredibly popular with the Roman public, and even some after his reign, despite the fact that he was condemned by most Roman authors writing histories about this period. There is a kind of alternate tradition that Nero was, in fact, a great man and a great emperor. And there's more to it than that even, but I'll get to that in a moment. Nero was an artist, and he also fancied himself an athlete. And so, as a young man inheriting the throne, he was content to leave the governing largely up to some courtiers, some of whom had been advisors to Claudius. Pallas was perhaps the individual involved in the plot with Agrippina to have Claudius killed. The rumors had him as her lover, but Pallas was a really capable administrator. He was a freedman, and Burrus was the Praetorian prefect in this period. Seneca was an intellectual. This is Seneca the Younger, by the way. His father had also been an intellectual, a historian of some renown. Seneca the Younger was a Stoic philosopher. And Thomas Africa doesn't, I think, do justice to Seneca the Younger. He sees him as this scheming individual who tried to manipulate Nero. But the alternate way of looking at this, and a lot of the literature about Nero, I think, goes in this other direction, would say that the early years of Nero's rule were effective, and Nero was able to do a lot of good things and build his popularity because people like Burrus and Seneca were calling the shots. So much so that they controlled Nero, and Agrippina kind of lost the initiative. And she tried to get control again by gaining the confidence of Nero's wife Octavia. But Seneca quite wisely kept putting young, beautiful women into Nero's bed as mistresses to keep him away from Octavia. This, I guess, is what needs to happen, when you've got an emperor who's too young and too distracted by other things to rule effectively. So Seneca was able to keep the initiative there. At one point, Agrippina even turned to Britannicus, the boy who had been passed over. This is Claudius' son from his first marriage. And tried to ally with him to overthrow her own son, and this led eventually to Nero ordering his mother's execution once it was sort of admitted that she was involved in the plot against Claudius. And so, Agrippina was a really special individual, I have to say. It's not a wonder then that Nero ended up being kind of screwed up too. After the first 5 years or so of the reign, Nero tried to take more and more responsibility on himself, and this is where the dark side of his personality came out. This would lead eventually to all of these early advisors like Burrus and Seneca being executed, and Nero, his violent, unpredictable nature came out in his relationships with his wives. Octavia, he, had a series of affairs on her. He then divorced her, and then eventually murdered her in addition to that. He divorced her because he was in thrall with this woman named Poppaea, who was a renowned beauty. But then, after Octavia was dead, and he married Poppaea, but then ended up killing her too when he kicked her, I guess, in the stomach while she was pregnant. That just sounds absolutely terrible, but it gives some indication of the kind of volatile personality that Nero had. Certainly not to excuse him, but this may be the source bias. This may be just interpreters trying to paint Nero in the worst possible light. So I think we need to take everything that they say with a grain of salt to some extent. Another thing that caused Nero some scandal was that a fire broke out in Rome in the year 64, and this ended up consuming a large part of the city. And Nero eventually did, organize things to put out the fire. But in the aftermath of this, there were many, and especially among the senators, some of whom had lost their homes in prominent places in Rome, that Nero was responsible for the fire, that he had set it on purpose in order to clear buildings away so that he could build a big palace for himself in the middle of Rome. Which it seems that he planned to do, because as soon as the fire happened, he in fact ordered those buildings cleared that had burned and started the project of building a new palace. And so this did not win him any favors, although the public largely continued to support him. Many of his policies did produce rebellion, though, and there was rebellion in the provinces from some of his tax policies. And finally, within Rome itself, the Praetorian Guard got involved in a plot against him. He was driven out of Rome, and as they were trying to track him down, he ended up committing suicide. Nero's last words, according to the sources, were, "What a great artist dies with me, or in me." And, I think we can tell all sorts of stories about Nero. One that I like is that, as I said, he was interested not only in poetry and playwriting. On that note, he, it seems, held performances of things he had written and would force all of his courtiers and senators to sit down and watch him perform. And I guess some of these performances were pretty underwhelming. But of course, you have to pay rapt attention to what the emperor is doing. Even more interesting is the case of him attending the Olympic festival in Greece, where he decided to enter the chariot race in the Olympic Games, which was the most prestigious of the competitions there. And instead of having one of his trained slaves drive the chariot, as was common, Nero decided that he himself was going to drive the chariot. And I just have to imagine that the organizers of the event were worried sick about this, that if the emperor got hurt in any way, that was probably going to mean that their heads would roll. And so, they probably told all the other racers to stay well away from the emperor. When the race started, Nero went through the first turn and crashed his chariot. And they pulled him out before he was hurt or anything. And the race continued and finished, and then they went to award the victor's prize, which would have been these olive wreaths, and they gave Nero first prize because, of course, if the emperor enters your competition, doesn't matter where he finishes, he's going to get first prize simply because of who he is. And Nero seems not to have had any problem with that, and in fact expected that would happen no matter what the results were. Right? So interesting figure. And that complexity of character and kind of the ambivalence of the sources comes out in some of the documents from this period. There was a tradition that started after his death, probably among the common people for whom he was still a kind of hero, given some of the things he had done on their behalf, that Nero hadn't actually died, that he had left and disappeared, and that he would come back. And so he shows up as this sort of King Arthur figure, right? The once and future king or something like the once and future emperor. But then, lots of other interpretations of Nero are quite scathing. In the Christian scriptures, he is the inspiration almost certainly for the AntiChrist. Why are the Christians so upset with him? Well, in the aftermath of the fire in 64, Nero ended up blaming this on the Christians, who were at that point a rather new and obscure religious sect in Rome. He rounded up many of them, put them to death in horrible ways in public places, and the Christians then interpreted him as this great persecutor all through their early writings about the history of the Christian church. It is thought that the number 666 and the mention of the Antichrist in the book of Revelation in the New Testament is probably a reference to Nero. At least that's one school of thought here. In the year that followed Nero's death, from late 68 to late 69, there were 4 emperors. And this is because Nero died without any heirs. And this was a problem, right? Because if this doesn't pass within the family, what do we do? At this point, we need to ask, okay, so who are the power brokers? Who can make or unmake emperors at this point? And I think we should point to the military, we should certainly point to the Senate, and we should look at the Praetorian Guard as well, right? And so initially the Senate intervenes, and there's a senator named Galba, whom they name as the heir to Nero, and they crown him as the next princeps. But he was quickly supplanted by a guy named Otho, who was initially the governor of a province in Africa, but he made it back to Rome and gained a great deal of support, and so he kind of ousted Galba and became emperor. He was succeeded by a guy named Vitellius, who was a general, and then finally the general who had been sent to quell a rebellion in the east in Judea. He gained the support of many of the legions of Rome, especially the eastern legions, but also some along the Danube River. And with their support, Vespasian, as he's called, marched on Rome, defeated Vitellius, support for any other dried up, and Vespasian then became the emperor. And he would start the second dynasty of emperors, the Flavian dynasty, which we will talk about in the next video lecture. So I know that was a lot of detail. I'm not going to go into that much detail about every emperor. I do find the Julio-Claudians, this incredibly dysfunctional family, interesting. But, we need to read the cultural sources that we're looking at this week against this background of political chaos to some extent, right? So hopefully that was helpful and was not too confusing. And so we will talk briefly, the next video will be quite brief, about the Flavian dynasty next time. Thank you.